Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out and welcome to first afternoon of the second edition of Open Book Cape Town. And this is a very, very special event that you are at this afternoon, which is the first of 3 events that we're doing at Open Book, which form part of the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference. I'm going to leave it there for now. I'll talk a little bit more later. Because I'm very, very happy to introduce and to hand over to Nick Barley, who is the director of the Edinburgh International Book Festival, who are the sort of originators of the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference and the 50th anniversary edition that we are participating in at the moment, together with the British Council. Before I hand over to Nick, I'll just say that I went over to Edinburgh to visit the festival there and to participate or to be at the first Writers' Conference probably about a month ago. And I had an absolutely fantastic time. I was there, and everybody at the Edinburgh Festival were wonderful hosts, as were the British Council. So for all of you who do bump into Nick over the next few days, please be very nice to him. Buy him drinks. Make sure he has a good time. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nick Barley.
Oh, thank you very much, Mervyn, for that very kind welcome. I thought you might go on for half an hour with that kind of praise. But now you all owe me a drink. But thank you very much indeed. It's a great honour and a pleasure to be here in Cape Town, in this fantastic city, and a delight to be here at the beginning of the second edition of Open Book. As Mervyn said, my name's Nick Barley. I'm director of the Edinburgh International Book Festival, and on behalf of the festival and the British Council, I'd like to welcome you all here to this part of the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference. Now, I just would like to spirit you back to 1962, 50 years ago last month, to Edinburgh, where a writers' conference took place. And it took place in a very different context from the one that we are experiencing today. Back then, of course, it was the height of the Cold War, where there was a full-blooded battle, really, between communism and capitalism. It was a time when culture, well, the word culture wasn't the same as the word we know now. It wasn't yet a globalized commodity. And there were certainly no literary festivals, as there are today. And in the UK now, there are something like 450 literary festivals, and I can see that with the launch of Open Book and other festivals around the world, the literary festival phenomenon is growing fast internationally. Yet back then, when 50 writers came together to discuss the state of literature at that time and to ask themselves why novels mattered at that time, they discussed 5 topics over 5 afternoons, and the results were nothing short of momentous. And I think they were momentous for 3 reasons. The first thing is that 10,000 people came out to listen to those discussions. The organisers had no idea that that number of people would come. But it became clear, as those writers stood up and argued about the state of the novel, that readers wanted to meet writers and to hear them talk about their ideas. And in my opinion, the 1962 Edinburgh Writers' Conference helped bring about literary festivals like Edinburgh's Book Festival now and like Open Book today. It was the start of something. It was momentous for another reason, in that that event, which included people like Norman Mailer and William Burroughs, names who are now very familiar to us, but back then they were not familiar. Well, Norman Mailer was slightly known, William Burroughs was totally unknown. But as a result of that writers' conference in Edinburgh, William Burroughs was published in Europe and he became famous. He became a literary superstar thanks to that writers' conference. And it was momentous for a third reason, in that back then, 1962, that buttoned-up city of Edinburgh, a Calvinist city, which was still struggling from the effects of the decline of the empire and the end of the Second World War, listened to writers talking openly about drugs, about sexuality, homosexuality in particular, and about pornography. And that it was a shock. I mean, it hit the front page of the Scotsman, and people were absolutely, completely shocked at the kinds of topics that were talked about. And it heralded, among other things, the beginning of an era of free thinking, free love. You know, this is right at the beginning of the 60s. And as a result of that, Edinburgh's festival soon became known as a place for innovative, experimental thinking. And of course, as we know now, Edinburgh is the world's most famous festival city in the month of August. So it was a momentous conference. And as I realized that we were about to celebrate the 50th year since that Writers' Conference, I wanted to do something to mark the 50th anniversary. Edinburgh now, of course, has become one of the best respected literary festivals in the world, and not 10,000 people, but 225,000 people came to our book festival, which ended a couple of weeks ago. And I wanted to look at what has changed in those 50 years since that 1962 Writers' Conference. Now, of course, there is no Cold War. The Berlin Wall is gone, and Europe and the US, at least, have I was going to say enjoyed, but have gone through 30 years of liberal democracy in which I think you could fairly say that the market has been the dominant ideological tool by which policy decisions have been made. That certainly wasn't the case back in 1962. But now, perhaps more fundamentally, we're at a different time because we now live in the information age. An age when it's possible to send a book around the world at the touch of a button via email. It's possible for us to tweet about what's going on here, as I will be doing in a second when Keith stands up to talk, and for the rest of the world to listen in on our conversation. Again, that's something that didn't happen in Edinburgh back in 1962. So, together with the British Council, because of its fabulous networks all around the world, we decided we'd like to organise a writers' conference again. One that could take place not only in Edinburgh, but also all around the world. And so, this edition of the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference here in Cape Town is one of 16 different editions that take place around the world. From Kuala Lumpur to Krasnoyarsk in Siberia, from Beijing to Berlin, from Toronto to Trinidad, this will be a truly worldwide conversation. And importantly, it discusses the same topics that they discussed back in 1962. So that's our point of reference. So we can look at the similarities and differences between writers then and writers now. And we can once again ask, why do we carry on with this strange form of the novel? When it's so easy to get hold of information via a screen, when there seems to be an urge for computer games and so on, why do novelists carry on doing this strange thing? And I think Keith will help us to think about that. So, that's all I want to say, really. It's absolutely wonderful that the Writers' Conference is taking place here in Cape Town. In this post-apartheid era, I think it's wonderful that we have a chance to talk about these kinds of issues. And I think it's neat, because just as 1962 heralded the start of Edinburgh's book festival, so this conference, although it comes a year after the launch of Open Book, I think it comes at the beginning of what I hope will be a long tradition of literary festival here in Cape Town. And I would just like to celebrate the great work that you're doing, you and Frankie are doing, Mervyn, here with Open Book. And on behalf of the Book Festival and the British Council, I'd like to say welcome.
Thank you, Nick. I'm going to ask Keith to come and deliver the keynote address in a minute. First, just a couple of comments, and just to sort of set the frame a little bit about how the Writers' Conference is going to work. The first thing is I have been told I do just need to tell everybody that all the three events are all being filmed. So if anybody's got any sort of particular issues around that, you've been told. Apparently, I've now covered myself. How the three events are going to work is that in each of them, as you know, there's a topic, and the topic today is censorship. And as Nick said, these all reflect themes that were discussed at the conference in '62. Each of the events has one, or at least one, keynote address. One of the one later this evening has two. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And the idea is that the keynote address or addresses look at a particular element of the topic, and that the people, the writers giving those keynote addresses have not been instructed to interpret the issue in any particular way. It's been up to them to address the issue as they see fit. After that, we're going to open it up for discussion. And again, the discussion should not be limited to the particular frame that the person delivering the keynote address has taken. The discussion is open to anything to do with the theme, and today's theme obviously is censorship. Having said that, I will ask people to try to kind of respect the nature of the discussion as we go, and to try and build on each other's points, so we don't have too much of a kind of completely kind of set of non sequitur random interventions. But I suppose it's my job as the chair to ensure that doesn't happen. I'm going to hand over to welcome Keith Gray to deliver his address on censorship. Keith says that as a teenager, he went from being a reluctant reader to a passionate reader, and then straight on to being a dedicated writer. He published Creepers, which was shortlisted for the Guardian Children's Fiction Prize when he was only 24. So it's these kinds of writer biographies which generally induce hatred in booksellers, nothing to do with jealousy. Since then, he's written a number of critically acclaimed novels, which have been won or shortlisted for several major awards, including the Carnegie Medal, the Costa Children's Book Award, the Scottish Children's Book Awards, and the Smarties Book Prize. Never an author to shy away from difficult subject matter, Keith's novels are often deemed controversial, and he recently edited two groundbreaking, if provocative, anthologies for teenagers, Losing It, which tackles first sexual experience, and Next, which explores ideas about the afterlife. And I think you're going to hear about how his interest in producing these kinds of books informs his take on the subject at hand. His novel Ostrich Boys has been adapted for the stage, and it's going to embark on a UK tour in 2013. And Keith lives in Edinburgh with his partner, their daughter, and a parrot called Bellamy. Please welcome Keith Gray.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming along this afternoon, and it is fantastic to be here in Cape Town. So very many thanks to Open Book, to the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference, Edinburgh Book Festival, and to the British Council for having me. When I was 14, I was an outstandingly mediocre student, but a voracious reader and a determined wannabe writer. I read many how-to creative writing guides and even crowbarred some money out of my father to be able to attend a local creative writing night class. And the advice I kept hearing, what seemed to be the golden rule, was to write about what you know. Although I may have broken that rule many times over the years, for the following few minutes, I believe I'm going to stick pretty closely to that rule. I write for children and for teenagers, so this is my perspective on censorship from within the world of kids' books. And I'd like to start by reading a letter I received a couple of years ago, which I've kept. Dear Sir, I found the language in your book, Warehouse, most objectionable. At a time when schools are struggling with literacy standards, do you really have to use language of that sort? I note from the back cover that it is unsuitable for younger readers. I am 76. How old do I need to be? Yours sincerely, Mr. A.D. Cartwright. Now, I'd love to dismiss Mr. Cartwright as narrow-minded, or as, at his age, out of touch, perhaps. It would be so very easy to simply ignore him. But I can't, because Mr. Cartwright is possibly a grandfather, and as a grandfather, he is definitely a gatekeeper. Despite what you might think you know about the world of children's and teenage books, we are not all frightened of the big bad wolf or of the troll that lives underneath the bridge. And if you ask me, Lord Voldemort was just given bad press. What keeps us awake at night, what makes us rewrite and redraft and redraft and rewrite, what we're terrified of finding lurking beneath our beds when the lights go out, are the gatekeepers. It's all about access. Young people accessing books, writers accessing their readers. Unlike many adult readers, the majority of young readers don't buy books. They are given books as gifts. They have books forced on them in the classroom, or they borrow books from a library. I may write a novel with an ideal reader in mind, perhaps a 13 or 14-year-old, but before my book reaches my reader, it will be confronted, challenged, and vetted at several stages, approved or not by the gatekeepers. There are obviously the publishers and editors, and it goes without saying that all writers need to keep them on side. But they have been known to be a disappointingly timid bunch when it comes to the more provocative children's books. There are also the librarians, the majority of whom I've found to be brilliant, knowledgeable and passionate about children's books. But then there are those who bring their personal agenda to their bookshelves. Next are teachers, who often, unfortunately, have much less knowledge about current children's books and who can decide against using a particular title in the classroom. And of course, then there are the parents and grandparents who, on the whole, have the least amount of knowledge about children's books, except for the ones they read when they were young, you know, the nice ones. If any one of those people takes the slightest offence, if the book cannot successfully navigate the gatekeepers, then somewhere along the way, a gate closes shut. That book shall not pass. And my ideal reader may never discover that the book I wrote with them in mind even exists. It's also possible I myself may never discover a gate has been closed. So often these gates ease shut with a whisper, rarely ever with a clang. So what is it that gatekeepers are keeping their beady eyes out for? Which blips on their radar are indecent exocets primed, ready to explode the sweet nature of the nearest unsuspecting youngster? Well, there's the F-bomb, for one. Language is one of the biggest complaints, as Mr. Cartwright points out in his letter. And I freely admit to using the F-word twice in my 68,000-word novel. But I also feel Mr. Cartwright is showing his age here. I don't think he's taken into account that all language, even profanity, evolves. Sexual swear words have lost much of their power with the younger generation. The vast majority of young people don't give a fuck about the F-word. They don't use it to offend each other, they use it to offend their elders. So if I cut that word, for whose sake is it that I'm doing the censoring? My readers or the gatekeepers? And this immediately brings into focus one of the great dilemmas of the teen fiction writer. Do I mirror the lives of my teenage readers, no matter how distasteful? Or do I attempt to teach them some kind of better way? Many gatekeepers believe books for young people should be worthy, character building, educational. It's a flawed argument, and one I'll return to. But from sexual swear words to sex. Here's a topic that can get the gatekeepers not only closing the gate, but also melting down the key, as I've personally discovered with a book already mentioned called Losing It. Losing It is an anthology I put together for Anderson Press in the UK, published in 2010. 8 different authors, 8 original stories, all tackling the same tricky subject of first sexual experience. Last November, I was invited into a school in Scotland to give a book talk to a group of 15-year-old students, and the session had been arranged about 3 months in advance, but the week before I was due to visit the school, I received an email asking me not to talk about Losing It. I mean, I promised I wouldn't read from the book. I promised I wouldn't perform the book. But I'd said I'd like to mention the book because, you know, it was my most recent book, and maybe, but no. I called the school up, I spoke to the head teacher, tried to explain that the book wasn't a how-to guide or even a biology lesson. The contributing authors included Carnegie Medal winners, a UK children's laureate, established writers who handled the subject matter with great care and sensitivity. But no. The head, who did seem genuinely concerned, read aloud the blurb on the back cover. He didn't need to, I knew what it said because I'd written it. He said, going by the blurb, he didn't feel the book was suitable for his school. You've not read any of the stories? I asked. Maybe if you read the stories you'd, but no. He told me his biggest worry was the parental reaction to having this kind of book on the school library shelves. I asked him, what kind of book did he mean? He read me the blurb a second time, but it hadn't changed from the first reading, so I gave up and said I felt it best to cancel my visit. He told me he was sorry I felt that way, but after our discussion, admitted he agreed. He finished by explaining that they were a Catholic school, and as such, and this is where I will quote him directly, as such, we will only teach lessons about love and sex from the moral perspective of the Catholic Church. And that hurt. Was he calling me immoral? After I'd put the phone down, I suddenly wished I'd said, "The book isn't meant to teach lessons. That's not why it was written." I tried to phone him back to say so, but he was too busy to take my call. I also wished I'd thought to ask about his anxiety over parental reaction. He hadn't once, not once, had he said he was concerned how the book may affect his students. His main concern was pissed off parents. I wish I'd asked, for whose sake was my book banned? Here's the rub. If I wrote novels for adults and someone took umbrage at what I'd written, they'd call me distasteful, maybe offensive. But as a writer for children and teenagers, I get accused of corrupting the reader. It's a strong and worrying distinction. Since that phone conversation last November, I've learned of a second school that has banned Losing It from their library, and there are rumours that more may follow suit. This second school in my home of Edinburgh is unfortunately another Catholic school. And I say unfortunately because these bannings don't seem to be due to the offensive language or due to the subject of sex itself, but because the book doesn't conform to a particular worldview or philosophy. Do these schools only want their students to read approved, sanctioned, authorised books? Yes, unfortunately it seems they do. But approved by whom? Authorised by whom? There does seem to be a stealthy and silent censorship when it comes to children's books. I've always believed reading is about opening your mind, about learning empathy, about looking at the world from a stranger's point of view. All notions, I believe, should be front and centre when writing for young people. So am I really claiming certain books get banned or censored because they make young people think too much? Are we scared they'll not think the way we want them to if they read the wrong book? Do we not trust young people who can think for themselves? I mean, it's one hell of a conspiracy theory. Excuse me, the shaking is nerves, not alcohol, I promise. I recommend you browse the American Library Association's list of challenged books. You'll find it on their website. Every year, the American Library Association publishes the top 100 most challenged books in America and the reasoning behind the challenges. Bridge to Terabithia, written by Catherine Paterson, challenged because death is central to the plot, but also challenged because it encourages disrespect of adults. James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl, challenged because of profanity and that it encourages disrespect to adults. Harriet the Spy by Louise Fitzhugh, challenged because it teaches children to lie, spy, talk back to adults and curse. How to Eat Fried Worms by Thomas Rockwell, challenged because it encourages children to engage in antisocial behaviour. At a guess, frying worms and then eating them. A Light in the Attic by Shel Silverstein, challenged because it promotes disrespect and more specifically, challenged because one of the illustrations might encourage children to smash plates so they don't have to dry the dishes. The list goes on and on. And I'll ask just one last time. For whose sake would these books be banned? Somewhere a gatekeeper has become concerned that a book could undermine their implied authority or set a child off along a path of which they do not approve, meaning a gate has closed and there are children who may never know these books even exist, access denied. In many of the book protests I've encountered, the implication seems to be that the supposedly wrong type of book could corrupt not only the minds of children but society as a whole. And yet, if this were true, wouldn't someone have spotted the correlation between reading challenged books and criminal behaviour? Surely our prisons must be brimming over with the grown-up readers of banned books. It appears the opposite is true. I'm yet to hear of a convicted criminal who acknowledges with a heavy heart that his unlawful behaviour was influenced by James and the Giant Peach. A survey conducted by the UK's National Literacy Trust in 2008 discovered that 70% of pupils who have been permanently excluded from school have difficulties in basic literary skills, while 25% of young offenders have reading skills below those of the average 7-year-old. These troubled youngsters would unfortunately struggle to read any children's book. never mind a challenging one. Young people need good books. Actually, young people need great books. They need the best books. Here's the thing that's so wonderful for me as a teen fiction writer: the readers. Teenagers are such a wonderfully open-minded audience. Ask yourself, when was the last time you read a book you didn't want to read? Not only read it, but studied it, dissected it, took it apart sentence by sentence, and wrote essays about it. It's so rare for us as adults to read anything we don't care to. We read novels that bolster our political views and confirm our beliefs and make us feel secure in what we already know we know. It's not often we genuinely challenge ourselves with our reading. Yet every day at school, teenagers may find themselves in a situation where not only are they forced to read a novel that challenges their views and beliefs, but they then also have to study it with enough discipline to be able to pass an exam. And here I am, an adult kicking off this debate, but let's be honest, I don't expect any of you to change my mind on any part of this subject. As a 40-year-old, I'll argue to change your mind, because me, I'm already pretty satisfied with what I think and what I believe. Thank you very much. But if I was a 14-year-old, I'd still be figuring out exactly what it is I think I know. I'd be arguing not to change your mind, but to discover my own. Reading at that age is an exploration and hopefully a discovery of who you are, where you fit in, and what you aspire to be. What an exhilarating, inspiring, challenging audience to write for. Perhaps this is the reason some worry that the adult literary novel is stagnating. I can't help but get the impression that in the adult world, it's often a case of writers writing for themselves and for people just like them. Where's the challenge in that? We teen fiction writers don't write for ourselves because we're not kids anymore. We have an audience and we have to be much more inventive with our fiction for them. Please, please go read David Almond, M.T. Anderson, Aidan Chambers, Jack Gantos, John Green, Margot Lanigan, Patrick Ness, Meg Rossoff, a few examples among many. The adult novel may well be dying, but the teenage novel is flourishing. Something I would say about writers for young people is that, always conscious of the gatekeepers, we do a heck of a lot of self-censoring. And perhaps the best kids writers are the ones who see it as a skill, as part of the craft. They are able to successfully navigate the gatekeepers without losing any of the power, any of the potency, or any of the intention of their writing. And most importantly, without patronising the readers. I've seen teen fiction novels fail to reach their audience because the gatekeepers have barred the way, and I've seen others fail because young readers have found the books to be too weak or patronising. I'm beginning to believe self-censorship is a valuable skill or talent a writer for young people needs to attain. And before I finish, I feel I must mention age banding, which has yet again raised its ugly head in the UK. The idea of putting an age certification on the cover of books, similar to movies and computer games. It's a notion Mr. Cartwright might buy into. At least he'd know exactly how old he needed to be to read one of my books. But age banding is a notion the majority of the UK-based children's authors have fought against these past few years, because that number on a book's cover would just become another gatekeeper by proxy. I believe young people should be allowed to access books tackling subjects which even we adults find unpalatable. If a child or teenager lives in a world where bullying, racism, suicide, faith, love, sex, terrorism are all everyday concerns, should we really be banning them from gaining knowledge of these issues? If a young reader is granted some access to that world from the relative safety of a novel, it could help them towards getting their heads around the issue long before they are forced to encounter it in real life. These issues never get age-banded in the real world, after all. Are we committing a disservice to the next generation under the guise of protection? Back when I was a 14-year-old wannabe writer, I witnessed abuse, I encountered drugs, I lived in a nation rocked and rocked again by IRA terrorism. I was an inventive swearer. I fell in love and I lost my virginity. All the while I was repeatedly told the golden rule, if you want to be a real writer, was to write about what you knew. But I didn't want to distress my parents, and I didn't want to displease my teachers by admitting my true knowledge. So I wrote ghost stories instead. I remember thinking there seemed to be little point in writing books that some of my friends would never be allowed to read. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Keith. Before we open it up for discussion, I'll sort of attempt to frame it slightly. I want to refer back to the discussions that happened in Edinburgh a month or so ago. And there, Keith's sort of counterpart, if you like, was Patrick Ness, another young adult author who delivered the keynote address on censorship. And Patrick delivered an interesting address because he took a lot of us by surprise, where he basically took the whole topic of censorship and he spoke about self-censorship. And that is something which he feels very strongly about, which is something that writers need to address at the moment. I'm just going to illustrate what he had to say. I'm just going to quote from the beginning of Patrick's polemic at Edinburgh, where he says, "I had intended to open this polemic with some version of this true story. Earlier this summer, I was having dinner with friends, and our conversation turned to the role of the veil in Islam, starting with how to explain a burqa to a son raised to believe that men and women are equal, before leading into the veil's potential as a form of oppression against women. The friends I was having dinner with were two women, one a Palestinian raised in Jordan, the other English raised as a Muslim. And as our conversation progressed, it turned into how, for a number of reasons, some of them perhaps very good, it is far easier for them to discuss the issue of the veil publicly than me, a white Western male, no matter how nuanced or well-intentioned my views." Now, this is exactly the kind of thing I want to talk about today, the things we disallow ourselves to discuss. But a funny thing happened. I found myself drafting and redrafting the way I opened with that anecdote again and again and again, working so hard to make sure my role in that conversation was clearly understood and therefore impossible to misunderstand, that I found myself pounding the sentences into such painfully careful neutrality that they would end up meaning almost nothing. Patrick went on in his address to talk about the modern world that we live in, the impact of social media, the fact that there's no sort of privacy in the sense of the way we communicate anymore, that anything that he says can be out there on Twitter, on Facebook, etc., etc., etc. And then he went on, just one other brief thing I want to mention there, and I'll get back to Keith's talk in a sec, where he brings up, he talks about Salman Rushdie, and he says, who in this audience, that audience, this audience, I'm sure we'd get the same answer, would disagree that Salman Rushdie has the right to produce the satanic verses. There might be a few dissenters, but I suspect on the whole we'd rally around Rushdie and proudly claim our right and willingness to speak on any issue at any time. But would we be correct? Ask yourself truthfully, would you sit down tomorrow morning and start writing a novel with Muhammad as your central character? A Muhammad treated as a fallible man rather than a prophet. A Muhammad perhaps even criticized. This is a different question than should you be able to write this book, because I suspect again that we would probably agree here in this room, and I think it's probably the same here, if perhaps less so in the world at large, that of course you should, if the need to tell that story was great enough. But who here actually would? And I thought that was a very, very interesting series of assertions, and Patrick gave a lot more content to it, and obviously I'm not going to go through his whole speech now. But what struck me as I was listening to Keith speak and reading his paper a couple of days ago, I was privileged to have prior sight of it, is that the notion of the gatekeeper that Keith refers to in relation to censorship, and obviously Keith is speaking specifically around writing for young adults, and so the gatekeepers in terms of writing for young adults are quite clearly identified by Keith. You have a sort of second set of assertions, if you like, which is around censorship, and that is what Patrick was talking about in Edinburgh, where writers are their own gatekeepers. Okay, and then there's a third set where, if we certainly move on to writing for adults, when you say, well, who are the gatekeepers in terms of adult writing at the moment? And if you start interrogating that, you start thinking about who makes the choices about what gets published. And you start thinking about publishers, you start thinking about booksellers, humble booksellers like myself, and you start thinking about the people who buy the books, and you start thinking about that wonderful thing out there called the market. And now I wanted to, before we sort of start looking at some of these issues, I just wanted, Keith, if I could ask you just to sort of round that circle for us a little bit and bring back the market as gatekeeper into your experience as a young adult writer?
I think we're quite lucky in the children's book world that we have a safety net, especially in the UK. We have the safety net of school libraries. And so the market, whether we sell a lot of books through high street chains or independent bookshops or online huge booksellers.
You can say the word Amazon.
I'm allowed to say Amazon. If as a children's writer, you may not find all of my books in a high street chain, but I will be found in a school library. So from my point of view, and I think from the point of view of a lot of children's writers, it's not necessarily sales, it's readership that we chase. And our readership usually comes through these school libraries, and it's why we're terrified at the moment in the UK that school libraries are being closed. Yes, it's not. I do need to sell books. I won't be published if I don't sell books. But we do have this safety net of the school library network in the UK at the moment, which helps, I think, a lot of children's writers out.
Okay. I think it's interesting when talking about censorship in writing that I'm sure a lot of you have a similar response to what I had, and I'm going to shut up and open it up in a second for those of you who are wondering about that. When we think about censorship in this country in terms of writing and writers in the world of letters, the first thing that obviously comes to mind, I think, for all of us is our history of censorship in this country and books being banned under apartheid, and where there was a very clear kind of political junta which decided, what was okay to be read, and there was a very kind of clear sort of power relationship at the heart of that censorship. More recently, we have had to deal with the mutual protection of information bill and all the issues around that, which have obviously also pertain to censorship and concerned a lot of us. But I think it has been very, very interesting for me to both to listen to Keith's address and to Patrick's in Edinburgh, and hear these very, very different and I think important takes on censorship in the modern world of writing. And what I would like to do now is to open it up to the floor, to you. This is your session to contribute to the discussion on censorship. And I'm just going to ask you to, before you do speak, just to introduce yourself, and there will be a microphone which will miraculously appear just before you begin to speak.
It's an issue that has worried me for many years. It's a long time since I've read teen literature or young adult literature. But the thing that worried me very much when I was reading it in the 60s and 70s as a school librarian, as a public librarian, is that very often the subject or the problem was the focus of the book, that it almost read like case studies. I haven't read teen literature recently, so I'm wondering, has it actually changed, or is it still the focus of the writer? There are some children who grow up in ordinary homes, who aren't molested, who don't take drugs, who aren't raped, etc., etc. And that has always worried me about teen literature.
Do you want me to answer that? I'm very sorry. I'm afraid that does show your ignorance of what teen fiction, young adult fiction is in modern times. And I don't mean that in any disrespect, I promise. I think that in the UK, we didn't really have teenage fiction, have young adult fiction. Really, the first book you could arguably claim was a proper young adult book was in 1996, Melvin Burgess, his book Junk, which was the first that got to this label in the UK, really. And so we're a new form of writing in a strange way. We're not a genre. There's many genres within young adult fiction. But we are finding our feet, and we are discovering what we can do for the readers, as well as what we do for ourselves as writers. And I think that the writers, like I mentioned, and many writers out there, I think if you maybe did read one or two, it would maybe calm your fears about the great books that are out there at the minute aimed at this age group. And I know I'm talking about this age group, and if somebody says that, well, why should I bother, why should I read teenage fiction, then I'm very sorry, but that's incredibly narrow-minded, because, you know, just because you're not a teenager, it doesn't mean that the book might not interest you in some way. You know, like, you might not be gay, but gay fiction might be a cracking story, you know, it might be a great novel, or Southeast Asian fiction, or women's fiction. You know, I read women's fiction even though I'm a man. So cutting out that whole slice of books, that whole section of the bookshelf, saying, well, I'm an adult, I don't need to read teenage fiction, is an incredibly narrow-minded point of view, which I know is not what you was talking about, ma'am, but yeah, there's some. It has changed, it has moved on, but we are a developing form, because we're a new form. Teenagers were pretty new. Back in 1962 at the first Edinburgh World Writers' Conference, there was no teenage writers there, because it didn't really exist, teenage fiction, because teenagers were pretty brand new in those days as well. So.
Teenagers were brand new.
Well, it wasn't it the 50s? You lot in the 50s, first teenagers, maybe?
Dawn.
Also, we don't censor the newspaper, and so children are exposed all the time to rape, murder, the most incredible things on television, in all our media. So, of course, even if you've got a very stable home life, of course we must address these issues in young people's fiction.
Names, is this on working? Fiona Snickers. I'm a writer of novels for adults and for young adults. In South Africa, as Mervyn already mentioned, our concern is very much more the true meaning of censorship, the original meaning. It's a kind of top-down oppression that we had during apartheid and that we've been free of for about 16 years. We have something called a Film and Publications Board that suggests age restrictions and gives parents information about different works and publications, but doesn't necessarily restrict them. But now we are facing a media tribunal which is going to sit in judgment of journalists, and the Protection of State Information Act, which is also going to restrict what we're allowed to say and what we're allowed to write. I think what the discussion has been about up to now is a kind of selection, and as writers we select with every sentence we write, every word we choose. We're choosing a certain word rather than another for all kinds of reasons, because we think it might be more marketable or more appealing or more appropriate or whatever. We make these choices and decisions. And librarians, too, don't purchase every single book out there. They are always choosing which books to stock in their library because they want the kids to read those books. As parents, we go to the bookstore and we pick that book rather than another. To say that those choices are necessarily informed by censorship seems to be a kind of misnomer. I don't know if it is a real serious problem, whereas the kind of top-down oppression that we are possibly going to be facing quite soon in this country seems to be a much more pressing problem.
I think I'm going to go to the back in a sec. Fiona, I think we sort of take your point about the importance in understanding that people make choices, and that choices are not necessarily about censorship. I think that the distinction comes in when something is not chosen or not available for choice because of the subject matter. So then, and it is withheld. I think then that becomes a form of censorship, and that is different to the parent or librarian or anybody else looking at the shelf and just choosing between 2 or 3 different things. I think that's what Keith's trying to say. But there was a hand right at the back there, and then we'll come forward to Margie.
I'd just like to press you a bit on this question of the market as gatekeeper that you were asking about, Mervyn. And it seems to me that there is a conjunction at the moment of a kind of the capitalist market, you know, the idea of pleasing the consumer, combined with this, the new emphasis in the internet age of, you know, the importance of the reader. You know, we're all potentially writers. You know, there's a kind of new reverence for the reader, for audiences. You know, we don't just talk down to our readers, we have to engage with them, you know, which is very laudable in some ways. But I'm wondering if those two combined forces produces a kind of a self-censorship, or at least an idea of serving the ideal reader, which goes beyond the issue of library circulation that you're talking about. But I'm really interested in the ways that sort of perceived need to serve the reader, and whatever the imagined reader is, how that molds writers' work and molds the work that they produce. Does it restrict them in any way? I'm really interested in how that is changing writers' practice.
Okay, thanks, Elena. I think let's go with that for a minute. Any writers here who would like to comment on that, the extent to which they find themselves censoring themselves because of who they are writing for, whether it's to please readers or whether it is because they feel they're going to sell more books? Is that something that resonates at the back?
I come from a country where a couple of years back, writing the wrong things can get you killed. Like a bomb in your office, so on and so forth. We have moved on in Nigeria. But I want to tell a little story about censoring yourself and having yourself censored by your peers. I teach English in the university. And a couple of weeks ago, the students come to me and say, we want a short story for our journal. And I told them, I'm working on a new book. I may not be able to write something new for you, but I can give you the short story I used to do the structure for my new novel. And they said, okay. I gave that to them. Unfortunately, in quote, my new novel is about sexual slavery, prostitution, and organ harvesting illegally. And then a couple of days later, the young man came back and said, the editor said, we can't publish this. And I asked why. He said, it's too strong. And I now said,
sorry, it's too?
Strong. And I said, go back to him and ask him, what is strong in this short story for someone in first year, second year English, third year English, and final year English, between the ages of 18 and 25, and maybe more? I never got an answer. And in this situation, when you do an academic paper, you are required to find it out among your colleagues to get their inputs. So we took this same practice into our creative writing too. When you do a story or a book, you also find it around. And when you do this, you get inputs like, we don't think the public should read this because it has sex, it has violence, it's too raw, or it's too upsetting, it's too dark. In fact, that's the one I hear most, it's too dark. So I am happy to hear that somebody in Edinburgh was talking about self-censorship. But we should also look at peer censorship when it comes from your peers, your friends, fellow writers who think you shouldn't say this, you shouldn't write this because it's too dark. Thank you.
I'm also Keith. My novel was initially written in Afrikaans 28 years ago. It's taken 28 years to get it in the bookshelves. My publisher was asked to present it to Radio Sonder Grense, which is the Afrikaans radio station. They have a novel reading every evening. We got an email back to say that it reads perfectly, but there are 2 words which are politically incorrect, and as such, they cannot transmit the book. Now that is the kind of gatekeeping one really doesn't need. We should have moved on beyond that.
My name's Margie Orford. Perhaps it would be useful to distinguish the notion of censorship and kind of dissect it a little bit, because what you deal with in a constitutional democracy like here or in England or the US is erosion of a kind of liberty to express and various things. I work with PEN in South Africa, and I've just been at the International PEN Congress in Korea, which is really interesting when you're dealing with North Korean writers, for instance, who've just established a Writers in Exile committee where you get shot, as our friend at the back was talking about, in where you get very direct state censorship. And one of the complexities of censorship is perhaps to work out different ways of discussing how written things are dealt with. For instance, in Mexico, which is where most writers are killed at the moment in the world, it's often journalists who are dealing with a sort of narco state as they take it on. Turkey, more and more and more writers being detained. And what's interesting, so that's the sort of historical, political censorship where you can have quite direct action. One of the things that has concerned me is what's happening with Google and YouTube and this kind of massive agglomeration of information in one place. Index and Censorship has put a story up now about the fact that Google YouTube withdrew that very offensive video that was made, The Innocence of Muslims, without a court order, which I think is perhaps a new area of censorship that we're going to have to think of, where you have all information in the world controlled by one single company. And that, to me, is far more dangerous than old librarians worrying about whether you use the F word or not. So, and that is something that will affect writers in democracies as much as it does in very repressive parts of the world. So it's perhaps a new one. And one of the things I was thinking about is that books, published books, evil as publishers are, and I'm actually sitting next to my publisher here, this terrible representative of the capitalist system, who I love, and I always write things that my audiences will actually buy for. We need to think about how we're going to do that, and if books will, in fact, become a kind of samizdat, that books, published books, written books, will exist outside of the Google sphere. So perhaps we could look at that kind of censorship, where all information is controlled by one computer. Good plot for you there. But I do think we need to distinguish a bit between shopping censorship and bullet censorship and this total control.
Hello, my name is Zetu Gola. I'm going to go back to the point. Also, the lady at the back mentioned the whole thing about that there are children who are very innocent and they don't do this and they don't do that. I think as a young person, I'm very young, I'm 21, and most of my life I've gone to boarding school. And I think I can say that to a degree, parents are naive, because I know people, like hundreds, like literally hundreds, because I went to a very big school, whose parents had the perception that these kids were exactly what the lady at the back described. But the truth is that they need the kinds of books that you write, because parents think that children aren't doing anything, but they really are, but they just don't discuss it or portray a behavior that'll get them caught. For example, they'll have their first time and sleep over at a friend's house, but what they don't know is that that friend's parent is not there. So to a degree, I think a lot of the gatekeepers, like, they're very, very naive.
The youth has spoken. Anybody want to come back to Margie's point and Margie's concern around that horrible word that she used? Google Wiki what? The big blob out there in here. Yeah.
Lizzie from the Cain Prize. All I wanted to say to Margie's point is that that's why this conference is so interesting, because George Orwell wrote about that in 1984, and it's a concern that repeats itself, and it will repeat itself in each society as they come against each different censorship law which is passed. We had an Information Act passed after the terrorist atrocities in London, which restricted people in certain ways. But everyone lives and writes within the different freedoms of their national government, and it's often because of it's not the naivety of the gatekeepers, as the young lady said in the front, it's that they know full well what teenagers get up to, and they just want to keep it from their children until they can, hopefully protect them for as long as they can. I think that's why fiction is so interesting, because it explores the imaginative side that we don't want to reveal, perhaps in the public sphere or in the legal litigation sphere, all the other kind of protective institutions that we create in order to have a decent civil society. When it comes to the Cain Prize specifically, I have an interesting quandary when it comes to the stories that are written and entered And we publish in an anthology, and more people want us to take those books into schools, and they're written for adults, and it's adult fiction. So I've instituted a strict rule about no under 16s, because that's the age of consent in Britain for sexual intercourse. What do I do with those stories? I don't want to be told I mustn't give them to young children, but at the same time, those stories are fascinating, and they're very well written, and they teach people about different parts of the world, different experiences that Ifeanyi mentioned in Nigeria, which I think South Africans could learn from a great deal. Something that fascinates me. Thank you.
It's Eliane Glazer. I'm a writer from London, and I would like to add to Margie's excellent point about Google and Wikify world, which is that you know, we're coming back to the sort of language of democratization that I was talking about earlier, that surrounds us, you know, that we're witnessing a revolution in writing that's facilitated by the internet. And I think that language of democratization is really dangerous, because I think it disguises the fact that information is going to be controlled by these shady companies, but using this language of openness and sharing and democracy. And I think sometimes, you know, especially when it comes to the issue of censorship, and, you know, talking about teenage fiction, we can be quite iconoclastic towards these kind of parental figures, you know, who are censoring our work, you know, talking about these sort of parental gatekeepers, as it were. But actually, you know, in terms of publishers, these gatekeepers are true facilitators. You know, they enable literature and fiction to come into being. You know, and actually, I believe that the internet, you know, who set themselves up as being facilitators for exchange and ideas and so on, are likely to be the real censors, but in disguise.
I think to me what's very interesting about the internet is that when it first started, it was very open and very democratic. I think what we've had as it becomes centralized, like any monopoly, is that those things are closing off. And one of the particularly challenging things with dealing with censorship in relation to that form of publishing and transmission is that before you dealt directly between citizens and state in terms of repression. And in South Africa we had that experience. The government banned books and you couldn't read them, and so you knew who to fight with. The big problem now that, and one of the things that International PEN has been focusing on and that we've just got passed, is a declaration on digital rights and human rights and the links between freedom of expression and digital rights. And it's a very complex and new area to try and formulate within the frame of freedom of expression. But the big challenge that it faces all of us as writers and as readers and as citizens is that you now have a complicated triangulation between the individual, the writer and the reader, the state, and these big multinational companies, which are not only Google. I mean, Google is not evil. I don't think that at all, but you've got Sony, Ericsson, Nokia, and I think where it really became apparent was during the Arab Spring, where various internet providers were providing ISP addresses and where to find activists who were literally running a revolution via the internet. That was a highly complex thing, and I know the Swedes have done a lot of work in Sweden dealing with what their own Ericsson, for instance, was doing. But it makes political activism around censorship complex and new, because how the company behaves in a country where it's well regulated is going to be very different to how it behaves in Tehran, for instance, or in the Uyghur region in central China. So one of the things we need to think of in terms of censorship is how we deal with all of those things as citizens, because it will eventually affect us all in that 1984 way. We've got a sort of globalized way in which the great freedom of the internet is being closed, I feel, more and more by the fact that we don't know how to deal with this dispersed authority. Who do you attack? Your own government, or the fact that Nokia is giving your ISP address so the security police can come and arrest you if you live in Belarus or in Mexico? So that's the big challenge. I would love to hear what people's solutions are to how we take that further.
Get rid of e-readers and only buy real books.
Nick Barley from the Edinburgh Book Festival. Picking up on Margie's point, it seems to me that what we are dealing with here is the kind of globalization of the problem. Censorship, it seems to me, is usually about offence. People censor because they don't want to be offended, whether it's governments or whether it's Keith's gatekeepers. The issue of offence is the problem here. And I think Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses was a landmark book because it was the first of a series of offensive gestures, or at least that they were taken to be offensive by Islamic communities, internationally offensive acts, the cartoons published in Denmark. And so globalization has led to a different kind of problem around censorship. And I just wanted to throw in an interesting thing, which I had an email yesterday before I came out from Edinburgh. I was approached by the Communist Party of China, who they have an organization which trains future leaders of China. And they're proposing to bring 6 of these people to the UK to learn about social media and about how they can come to terms better with and understand better social media. And so I think that the globalization of the problem of censorship is also leading to innovative solutions by what were previously repressive, straightforwardly repressive regimes. So it's becoming a very complicated and international problem.
Who's going to just run to Margie's chat? Okay, Damon.
It seems to me we might be having a slightly different discussion if the title of today's talk was freedom of expression. We're a group here predominantly made up of writers, and I don't think there are going to be a lot of people who are advocating any restriction of freedom of expression. But I wonder whether people believe that freedom of expression is absolute. There was a case famously at the last Jaipur Literary Festival where Salman Rushdie was disinvited when there was a threat of violence from, again, an offended community. Now, a number of writers at the festival took it on themselves to read from his book, Satanic Verses, and when it turned out that reading from a banned book is in itself a criminal act, they fled the country. Now, I wondered, it seemed to me to raise a number of issues that if you believe that freedom of expression is absolute, why would you get up on stage and read from the book and then flee the consequences of that act? Margie is talking about people being shot in North Korea, and of course that happens in a number of countries. If you're the person who is breaking the law regarding freedom of expression, and you're the person who's going to bear the consequences, that seems to me to be one matter. But in a case like the Salman Rushdie event, where you know that by pushing freedom of expression to its absolute limit, people are going to die, and it's probably not you, it's other people. Is there not a responsibility to limit what is said or done? And I'm throwing that open as a question. I don't know what my own position is there. We've heard a lot about children's literature, young adults writing here, and yes, it seems to me self-evident that children, along with everybody else, should be exposed to all these topics, but is there a limit? In other words, should pornography be banned, for example? Are there damaging forms of expression that should be restricted? That's another way of approaching the same problem, where maybe not everybody is going to be on the same side, and I wonder if anybody would like to respond to that.
Limits to freedom of expression at the back.
Thank you. My name is Deji Olukutun, and I'm with Pan American Center, and I've worked closely with Margie on some of these issues. I actually raised my hand just in response to a very narrow point, which is the Jaipur festival. What happened was Salman Rushdie was invited, and then the festival organizers sort of disinvited him. And then a couple of writers got up and read from the Satanic Verses. And I don't know how many people have actually read that book. I'd love to see a show of hands how many people have read that book. It's actually a really difficult book to read. And Salman Rushdie is aware of this. He knows that there's I think he calls it the page 15 club, because of the density of his prose. It's really dense, and his storytelling is unusual, but that's why he's a fantastic writer. Anyway, Hari Kundru, I actually spoke to him in New York after this, and the result was that he was immediately slapped with 7 separate lawsuits because of that. And the passage that he read was, for people who've read the book, there's a very humorous passage where Salman Rushdie imagines London turning into a tropical climate. So hardly incendiary at all. And it turned out that the festival organizers actually didn't know what the law was. What they feared was that in reading that, the act of reading that passage would incite the listeners to violence, so would cause a riot, and that was the sort of justification. But it turns out that's not true. But in the heat of the moment, they backed down, so it actually was not a criminal act. It's just people didn't, when there's a mob, that suddenly police are there, they just decided to say, no, you have to step down. So I don't think, I agree with the point that there is a responsibility, there can be a responsibility on the part of the writer, and that is in Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The first 2 articles are sort of like, say whatever you want. The third article is, well, there's sort of a responsibility that the state, if you're going to incite people to violence, if you're going to affect people's morals. So I want to, there's an elephant in the room, something that made the international press and was on the front page of newspapers in the US, and maybe people are just tired of talking about it. But given that when I got on the plane, I think the royal family was trying to decide whether to sue because Kate Middleton had been filmed nude from a distance in some French magazine, which I thought was really interesting. So they want to ban these photographs. And then here there's the Spear of the Nation painting, which I think, and I think they're similar, this moral outrage. And I haven't heard anyone talk about the Spear of the Nation. Maybe you're tired of it, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Thanks very much. My name is John Madison. I work among other things, as a broadcast regulator in war zones. I have another point to make, but I will first make one minor comment on what you've said. I've been in several situations. Nigeria at one stage was one case where if people are dying because of something you've said, you put in an impossible position. Surely life has to come first. And it may be a temporary thing and you may navigate it in some ways, but I don't see how you can say, I'm going to continue doing something when you know people are dying. But that leads me to the other side of this coin, something working in war zones has made me feel more passionate about. And since this is an international conference, there's a kind of censorship I never ever see discussed, and it's a censorship in the first world, particularly in America and Britain, which seem to be the countries that most keen on waging these wars. And that is that your television never shows the effect of those wars. You never show what it really looks like in war when limbs are torn from bodies and heads are found in trees and all those things. And I really feel more and more strongly that if that were shown, even if it's after the watershed in Britain or however it is, instead of the very sanitized war we see on television, which is very much like the Hollywood war, what we see on the news is very close to the Hollywood war, where you see war in all its glory but none of its devastation. Well, not none of its devastation, but not the human carnage that we see in the cacophony of war and the terror in modern warfare. I would really like to hear somebody's response to whether there shouldn't be a discussion about showing the effects of war on American and British television, where those decisions are taken and the consequences are always sanitized. Thank you.
Well, one of the things, we'll get to Fiona and then Fanny in a minute, but just a quick response to John there. I mean, one of the things that any government waging war or thinking about waging war has to consider is keeping as much of their sort of constituency, their populace, on side and in support of the war. And so, I mean, there's a very, very kind of short path there to understanding why it is not in their interests of the ruling powers to release that kind of information. I mean, it goes back to the kind of political censorship that we were talking about earlier. I don't think it's a difficult thing to understand. Fiona, then I think it's Ifeanyi at the back, and then Lizzie.
I don't know if it's correct to conclude that if people were exposed on a daily basis in the privacy of their own living rooms to the horrors of war, that they would necessarily recoil in disgust. A few hundred years ago, executions used to be public, and people didn't sort of avert their eyes and wrap their children up in their skirts and bring them away. They went there as an outing and brought picnics and watched. So I think that the more you expose people to the horrors of war, the more desensitized they'll become, possibly even the more bloodthirsty, the more vengeful they will become. That's my theory.
Okay, I'm going to address what John said in a roundabout manner. Responsibility in freedom of expression. Okay, let's look at war. If you are going to show everything that happens during a war, are you being responsible for what you're showing? That's one. Then two, I'm actually wondering if there is any need to be responsible when you are exercising your freedom to express yourself. Because he mentioned Nigeria. I live in Nigeria. And sometimes, let's come back to this Christian-Muslim issue in Nigeria. The Muslim will say things about the Christian God that the Christian cannot say about the Muslim Allah. All right? And when they say this, nobody picks up arms, nobody burns buildings, nobody kills anyone. But when it's the other way around, things happen. Okay? I think the issue here is how we react to things like the gentleman in front said about offenses and things being offensive. If the Christian can take what the Muslim says about his God, why shouldn't the Muslim? I was happy when Deji was mentioning Salman Rushdie. The passage he mentioned was just hilarious. It didn't get anywhere near offensive. And for someone to say that Salman shouldn't come to a festival because of that was idiotic, as far as I'm concerned. So what I'm trying to say is this. Exercising responsibility while expressing yourself is actually killing the freedom in it.
Thank you. I think it's interesting to take it back to the idea of the narrative that frames what you see and the context in which you see those images. I think there are independent media in Britain who do show the atrocities and the consequences and the long-term effects of war, perhaps not in all of the detail that the people who witness it and experience it and lose people do. But Channel 4 News, for example, is being taken to court regularly for showing YouTube videos filmed in Sri Lanka, for example, of the atrocities there during the bombardment of the people in the Sinhalese government were destroying. So it's not the case to say, I don't think, firstly, that the British media doesn't portray in different spheres, but we have the same concerns you have with SABC. BBC gets taken over during a Tory government by someone who favours Murdoch or something, and we all panic about it, and we think that state-controlled television on the BBC is going to become a bigger issue. The internet, it goes back to, again, if people are broadcasting directly from where it happens, and we try to censor, I suppose, some of the worst images, but it does get across, and people do see it, and unfortunately we don't always get the governments we elect, and we get coalition governments instead. And also Ifeanyi, I think there were massacres in mosques by Christians in Nigeria at different points quite recently, so I think it's the narrative that frames what you see. That's why novels sometimes do work, to expose like the multifaceted, complex situations in which things occur, and that you can't take a judgment often in a situation where if you filmed someone who was starving in Ethiopia, as some of the people have had, moral quandaries about later, should they have helped that one person they took a photograph of, or should they have told the world this is happening, and who is right in that situation? It's a really difficult question.
Sorry, Lizzie, just a quick question before we move on. You said at the beginning where you were talking about as an example of what is being reported in the UK. Who is taking Channel 4 to court over those kinds of things? You said they would face legal challenges then when they...
I think that the editor of the news got taken... I mean, he wouldn't be imprisoned in Britain, but I think the Sinhalese government's links with the British government meant that they were... It's being... Ofcom, yes. I mean, they were being told off by it's the regulator. We have a separate body that regulates our media, supposedly separate from government.
Okay.
And they tried to get them not to show the film footage, and they'd only showed partially bits of it, but they're using it in some of the war tribunal kind of... There are people who want to use that evidence in attempts to take people to court, into the International War Tribunal courts. So it gets very convoluted because the litigation is long, but they still showed much of that imagery.
Catherine.
My name is Catherine Schultz. I'm a journalist, author, and book critic. It's really interesting, I think, the question about to what extent we should display the carnage of war. I certainly believe that we should do so more than we should, but in the context of a conversation about censorship, it strikes me as a very tricky point, because the implication is that if we show war in its full and awful reality, it is going to change people's behavior. And that strikes me as very akin to an argument that censors love, which is that if we show other pieces of reality in their full form, people are going to mimic that behavior. If you write children's books that include scenes where kids are doing drugs, kids are going to do drugs. If you let people show pornography, suddenly people are going to, engage in pornographic acts, so on and so forth. And so this strikes me as a little bit of a slippery slope. The implicit argument being that that literature is causative, it makes things happen, and it makes people behave in certain ways. And so it seems to me that the heart of the question, something maybe we should be asking ourselves, is, do we believe that? Do we believe that fiction does produce, does incite people to action? Does it incite people to the action that's described? And it also strikes me that, it calls on us to make a distinction between journalism and the forms censorship take in journalism and what they take in fiction, because I think we expect and should expect novels and fictional forms to be doing very different kinds of work than non-fictional forms.
Okay. Margie, and then the front, and then John.
To get back to a more literary aspect, away from the landmine of television news, a literary aspect of censorship, perhaps something that's invisible often with the dominance of English as a global language, is the fact that less and less money is being spent in literary translation. And one of the great values of the novel is that it does transmit views into other cultures, understanding of other worlds. And fewer and fewer novels are translated, and fewer novels are bought and read in different countries. And I think we lose such an enormous amount. South Africa is a multilingual society in which most books are published either in Afrikaans or in English. And I think it's a great loss. It's one of those losses that we don't even realize, because it's loss of language and things and views of things that we don't even realize that have been there. But one of the things when we think about censorship and of a world literature is how we ensure that we read the books of other people, how we find ways of bringing them in and reading them and seeing them. Because the great gift of the novel, and I think why it's endured, if we go back to why you first discussed it in 1962, Mr. Edinburgh, was the fact that the novel it encapsulates so much of a notion of humaneness and humanism and understanding. So it might be an important thing to think about in this shifting world, how we keep this idea of translation and literary translation and reading each other alive, because unfortunately digital media is as dominated by English and the big languages, Mandarin and perhaps French and Spanish, and those smaller ones are slipping away, the smaller languages are slipping away, and with them come alternative views of what we do. So perhaps we could think about censorship, that sort of quiet censorship that comes through not reading each other or not reading other languages.
Just to jump in a little bit there, at the Edinburgh version of this, at the Edinburgh Writers' Conference, a lot of the writers had a closed session without an audience present where we talked about digital media and the state of the market, and we talked about this issue of translation. And if you were to go to the Edinburgh World Conference, World Writers' Conference website, there's a statement of intent that many authors and many people outside now are signing, and one of the points on that is about doing something about translation, you know, about how to bring through these languages, because English is so dominant in the publishing world. So I would highly recommend you have a read of that statement of intent, and if you agree with it, please do sign it. It's on, as I say, it's on the Writers' Conference website.
Emmanuel Delgois from the French Book Festival, Étonnant Voyageur. France has a long history of censorship, especially in the literary field. Maybe some of you have heard about two famous trials in the 19th century. One was for Charles Baudelaire about the Fleur du Mal. The other was for Gustave Flaubert for Madame Bovary. When we read the contents of the prosecution for those two trials, it just makes laugh, you see, because it looks ridiculous. So the censorship is evolving as societies and culture evolve. More recently, in France, a couple of months ago, a French writer published an essay celebrating as a hero this mad guy of Norway who killed 79 persons. And well, there were hundreds of intellectuals in France who expressed their indignation and signed petitions. And 2 days ago, in a satiric newspaper, there was again cartoons mocking the Prophet Muhammad. You see that? So all the Muslim community in France, you see, were shocked by that, even if those cartoons were aiming at radical Islamism, not at Islam. So I think that the frontier between what looks acceptable and what looks unacceptable is a permanent debate, you see, and very hard to define it, I think.
Okay, John?
Thank you. Just to respond to the points that were raised, I guess my specific concern is that in most countries, and in this case America and Britain, there's a cycle to war. The electorate is very enthusiastic about the war in the beginning, and 10 years later wants to get the hell out. So I'm more concerned about the countries that we, or whoever the we is, wage war on. And I don't think it's the same as saying if you show violence, people will kill, or if you show pornography, people will rape. We're talking about electorate public opinion. And I think if you showed them a little bit more of what their wars did, closer to the time when they were doing it, that cycle might be shortened. And I do think public opinion is affected in that way. It's a different kind of act from, you know, reaction to pornography or something.
I want to go back to the point which Damon raised and a few other people. It's been sort of addressed in different ways and touched on, and just see whether we can just sort of answer it, look at it, and that is the question of the limits to the freedom of self-expression, which obviously is a freedom that we all kind of hold quite dear, but there seems to be a sort of sense that there are limits, but it's quite difficult to define what they are. Margie, again, you can have a go at that.
Can I just, sorry, I was surprised that, to be honest, I was surprised nobody came at me with this question, because here I am writing for young people and claiming that I can write for somebody's son or daughter, about these big issues. You know, I've never met their son or daughter. How dare I say that I can talk to somebody's child about drugs or about sex or something, when, you know, it's their child. What right do I have as a writer to try and put ideas or put thoughts or put morals or put messages inside somebody else's child's head? Sorry, coming on from Damien's question, you know, what is the limit of what I could write? I was very surprised that nobody, I was expecting it. I was expecting somebody to come back at me and say, well, what right do I have to do that as a writer? And then we maybe talk, you know, sorry, I'm trying to lead on a little bit from Damien's question. Well, that is it. That I don't know, to be honest. I think when it comes down to the book I mentioned, the book about first sexual experience, my theory on that is that young people, they learn about sex from different outlets, whether it's the sort of the nuts and bolts from a biology teacher, whether it's the lies from their friends at school, or whether it's hopefully the emotional side from parents, perhaps, I don't know. And maybe fiction could offer them, because fiction's all about empathy, maybe fiction could offer them a different point of view. That's why I agreed to do that anthology. But I don't know what right I have, but, you know, what right do we as writers have to say the things we do if we think it's going to upset others?
I don't think that is the real question. I don't think the question is where do those rights start, who has the right, who gives you the right to write about anything. I think certainly in a sort of environment like this, I think almost everybody would agree that, your starting point is that as a writer, you have the right to write about whatever the hell you want to write about. And that's given. The question becomes, where does that line stop? Does it stop? Is there something that you're not allowed to write about, or that you shouldn't write about? And I think that is the question that we're starting to touch on. I don't think it's about who gives you the right to write about any topic. We can write about whatever we want. Margie, you've been very patient.
I'll talk about the children's writing. I have a great number of children myself, and for them, they just read anything. And children will censor you. If you write badly, they won't read your book. So don't worry too much about... You know, if you write a bad...
No, I'm a great writer. I'm not worried at all.
Okay. So there you go. I must say, this is an aside on limits to freedom of expression, but when my children were smaller, I would say to them, they'd say, shall I read that book? Because I've got a no censorship policy at all. And I'd say to them, it's got mating in it, which was what they called sex. And they would just spurn it immediately and for a few years, and then they got very interested in the mating section of my library, so I wouldn't worry about them too much. But just to go back to Damon's point about limits to freedom of expression, I'll quote the Muslim Brotherhood, actually, who said a really interesting thing about the attacks in Benghazi and in Yemen and various other places that they'd been. It was a very interesting response, because they absolutely condemned the killing of people who had nothing to do with the creation of the film The Innocence of Muslims, and at the same time they condemned and said the film, which seems to me an incredibly insensitive, stupid pastiche. So it was interesting that the Muslim Brotherhood came out between being able to distinguishing immediately in the aftermath of the bombing that the killing of innocent people was absolutely wrong, but that some more consideration needs to be put in what people said. And usually the limits to freedom of speech are quite narrowly defined in terms of the deliberate incitement to hatred and violence. And I mean, the most obvious ones, the French cartoons, these most recent French cartoons are very offensive, but in my view, they are not an incitement to violence. I'm sure violence might well result from that. But, you know, if you take this debate about blasphemy laws and religion, which we all are convulsed with at the moment, and take it back 300 or 400 years in Europe, the result of blasphemy laws was the Inquisition, in which hundreds of people were killed and murdered for not doing or not believing the right thing. So we're all very afraid of how you deal with this increased polarization between what George Bush cursed us with, this kind of crusade that he was on, the first George Bush, I think, and the Islamic world, this false polarization between the two. But somehow we need to find, I think, a way to navigate that where you don't let go the notions of freedom of expression unless it's directly incitement to violence, saying like what happened in Burundi and Rwanda, where you had people calling on the radio to go and kill these people or those people. That would be an obvious one. And the complex thing that we have now in South Africa with this Marikana mine, there was a legal gathering in which Julius Malema, who I'm sure is not the most popular man in the room, who had been invited to speak and was going to speak, and he was prevented from addressing those miners. At a legal gathering, they had permission to gather, he was allowed to speak. To me, that is a highly dangerous precedent where a man who perhaps many people don't want to hear, particularly people in power, was illegally, in my view, prevented from addressing people that he'd been invited. That is uncomfortable. We know it would have caused perhaps more chaos. It was stopped. There was a great sigh of relief in the press, but it was a gross infringement. It was a censorship of those people's right to hear and his right to speak. So these are difficult issues.
I want to go back to this notion of causation in literature. Do novels cause behavior? And I think if you scratch the surface of any teacher, librarian, or parent, this is the root of their fear. This notion, especially with kids, that monkey see, monkey do. If a teenage girl reads about cutting and self-harm, it's going to put the idea into her head and she's going to want to do it. Whereas maybe if she hadn't read that book, it wouldn't even have crossed her mind. That's the fear with doing drugs, underage sex, all kinds of antisocial behavior. If kids don't read about it, maybe they won't do it. And obviously that's a very simplistic notion, and it's easy to laugh at. It's clearly risible. But we can't comfortably say, on the other hand, that copycatism isn't a factor in teenagers at all. We can see sort of waves of behavior becoming fashionable at certain times because they have prominence in the media, and then as they fade away, the behaviors fade away. So there's no doubt that there is some kind of copycat element. But whether that danger is enough to suppress elements in literature is something I'm not at all convinced about. And the other point, I think, is that our 21-year-old who made the point that many parents and teachers are laughably naive in their impression of what teenagers really get up to. Yes, that's true. And the thing about literature is that it gives kids a safe space in which to explore these issues. Rather let them read about drug dependency and the consequences of it, even if it is possibly in a slightly glamorized form or in whatever form the novelist chooses to frame it. Let them read about it in that safe space. It's words on a page. It's not actually happening. Let them read about a teenage pregnancy and go through the whole experience safely in a novel. And then make up their mind about whether they really want to engage in that kind of risky behavior. And I'm not saying that novelists have any responsibility to sort of make their books into object lessons, but just that the books are there and they provide that safe space to explore behavior.
The question about violence and war on television is something that I've wondered about myself, being from the United States. I never got it. I remember, I think it was 2003 when we were about to invade Iraq and going on Fox News and trying to make sense of what was going on. And they had these commentators. It was like missile porn. I don't really, like missile pornography. It was. They would take each missile and use a computer animated design, go through the whole thing, talk about how it was so accurate, how it was going to explode in certain locations. I never once saw, I think the first time I saw pictures of civilians killed in Iraq was in Fahrenheit 9/11, Michael Moore's film. And I think it's a very real thing. And it's something that our textbooks are also like that. At least they were when I was a kid. I didn't see a single, I think there were some famous Civil War photos of a famous battle, the Battle of Gettysburg, where you saw the bodies strewn out. And I think that those were, and then there was the massacre in Vietnam. And those were the two, I remember those photos very vividly because they were the only ones in textbooks that we had. And there was a book written by, sorry, I don't remember the name of the author, but it's called Lies My Teacher Told Me. And he did a survey of 12 different textbooks and tried to understand why they weren't including, first of all, real history, like a people's history of the United States, but then also why the authors were choosing not to put these battles in and choosing not to put these photos in. And often the authors did not know. That was the surprising thing. There was no like agenda. It was just, it didn't feel right to show these things to kids. So the problem is I don't remember, he came up with some solutions, but I don't remember them. But it's a really good book. I wanted to ask Keith up on stage about your own writing. And you mentioned, you talked about from your own right, whether you had the right as an author to speak to these kids. I'm just curious, are there limits? Is there anything that you would not write in your book for this age group? Or does anything go?
I don't think there should be limits, no. As I was saying in my speech, I think if a young person has to face it in the real world, then they should be allowed to face it in the safety of the novel, as has been said earlier as well. There'd be limits that I would not write about personally. I wouldn't write about things I don't know about. I don't think I could bring an honest voice to certain subject matters that I knew nothing about. But there'll be other writers out there that could handle those subjects with much more sensitivity, much more honesty, and much more experience than I could, if that makes sense. So there's things I would choose not to write about personally, yes, because I don't know about them. But I think within teenage fiction, young adult fiction, no, there shouldn't be any limits at all.
My name's Gabby Murray. In response to the gentleman behind me pertaining to the wars, as a child, I was very, very naive. I was brought up in a very closed environment. And then, as a young man, I was forced by an apartheid government to go to war and to go and fight on the borders for whatever good they thought it would bring. But the biggest effect on my life was when I saw a movie called Kitty Returned to Auschwitz, where this woman who was in the concentration camp took her children to go and see what happened in the concentration camp. And that had such an incredible effect on my life that if I had seen that movie before I was forced to go and fight in a war, I would gladly have gone to jail as the apartheid government held the sword over our heads and sit out my 6 years in jail rather than to go to war for 2 years if I knew what the consequences were. So what I'm saying is, Keith, you don't have to ask whether you have the right to write your books. You, in fact, have a responsibility to write that which you think is right so that the people can be informed. Not only the children, but also, and I agree with this young lady in front here, their naive parents. Because I deal a lot with youngsters with drug problems. And if they can actually see, I said to a lady one day, I want to take your son, who insists on getting a motorbike, to the orthopedic ward so that he can go and see what young people look like that have been on motorbikes. She thought I was a horrible person. But I think if her son had seen what other people look like without legs and what other people look like maimed, he would have a different notion than to insist on getting a motorbike. And the same with young people when it comes to sex and drugs. if they see what the consequences are, show the children what young 15-year-old, 13-year-old girls' lives are ruined when they sit with a baby, rather than to censor that. Show the people.
I do agree with very much of what you're saying, but I think it's that dangerous line of turning a writer into an educator or a social worker or a parent, and I don't think that's what the best books for young people do. I think the story still has to come first, and these issues that we're talking about, they can all be included in a great story that doesn't patronize or preach too much to young people. So I do agree with very much what you're saying, but I'd be very wary of thinking of teenage fiction as a vehicle for steering young people in certain directions.
The one point is that my mother tried to censor what I read, because there was no youth literature when I was 12, and I used to read the adult books, and she used to hide books from me that she thought I shouldn't read, and those are exactly the ones that I dug out and read. But the other thing is that when I was when I was about 13, we had a French evening at another school where they showed us a French film, and somebody must have picked the wrong film or not watched it first, but we ended up seeing this film on the Holocaust, and it was the most shocking thing. I mean, it blew all my assumptions about the world away, where you see these huge mounds of people who starved to death being bulldozed into mass graves, and I was like 12 or 13, and I'm thinking, nobody should see this, this isn't happening. I couldn't believe it. But the point is that I had nowhere to take that to. There was no one that you could, people didn't talk about these things. You just pretend, oh, that didn't happen. You couldn't talk about it to your parents, to your colleagues, your fellow pupils. And I think nowadays there's a different, certainly in our sort of class and culture, there's children, it doesn't stop with a book. They talk amongst themselves, and therefore come to form opinions, and explore the world through books and through exposure to things that are very uncomfortable.
Our time is running out. I think the hand that I saw at the back was a phantom one. We are going to leave it there in a minute. I just wanted to sort of reflect on a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think it has been an interesting, if at times difficult discussion, which I think this kind of topic is always going to be. And I do want to thank everybody who has come along and has participated in it. I think the interesting or important threads for me, and others would probably pick out different threads from a discussion like this. So I lay no claim to being, for this being a particularly, I'm going to say prescriptive is the wrong word, thorough summation. But particularly interesting things for me that have come up is the first is the notion of the freedom of expression, and it's a given that everybody supports freedom of expression. That's an easy one. The question is where you go with it and what the limits are to it. I think the interesting points have also been made about turning that question around slightly and looking at the way people respond to media activities or statements which might be regarded as controversial, inflammatory or something, but turning the responsibility away from the person who is making the utterance, but to the person who is responding to it and how they're responding, and why we don't look at that. The second set of issues which I think have had resonance in the room and which concern a lot of people are around the impacts of globalization, digitalization, what's happening, just the way our world is being shaped and changed in ways that we don't necessarily understand. And there have been a number of sort of specific comments and examples about that, and which lead us to a very different understanding of what censorship, the forms that censorship could be taking in, well, already there are now, but in the years to come as well. And then the third thread, which I want to just refer back to, which has also been one that has popped up in different ways in the conversation, has been around the impact of writing, whether it's novels, media, television reporting on war, and the impact that it does or doesn't have on the reader or the consumer of the media, if one can use that word. And I think that there's sort of there are nuances to that discussion and some quite different opinions, which I, for one, found interesting, and I hope you did too. I don't think any of these, clearly none of these are a kind of zero-sum game, yes, right, black and white, but I think that they are all very, very interesting points. And what they, I think, ultimately do point to is that the conversations that we have around issues like censorship today are probably quite different to those discussions that were happening 5-10 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. And I think that what this discussion has done is helped us, I think, everybody here, to think a little bit differently about some of these issues going forward. So again, thank you very much to all of you for your participation. I want to say a big thanks again in acknowledgement to the Edinburgh International Book Festival, as well as the British Council for working together with Open Book on this World Writers' Conference. As Nick mentioned, the conference continues in another 12 countries around the world before it ends up back at its home in Edinburgh in August next year. The plan is then to produce a book which will reflect on the different discussions that happen in different parts of the world. So I think the next 2 days also need to be understood in that context, in the sense that it's an opportunity for South African writers, readers, members of the South African book community, but as well as those others who happen to be here at this time, to contribute to that worldwide discussion which is going to be happening for this year. Years in 12 months as opposed to calendar year. Just to mention then the second and third events that are on the program. We're being very generous. We're giving you a whole hour's break before the next one. Tonight, Anki Kroch and Njabula Ndebele will be talking to the topic of should literature be political, and they're taking two very, very different tacks. And Judith February from IDASA will be chairing that session. That's later this evening. And then tomorrow, Anjali Joseph has written, I think, a very provocative and very good piece on the topic of a national literature, and she'll be presenting that 3:30 tomorrow afternoon. Both those events are here. Imran Kavadi will be chairing that tomorrow afternoon. Last word of thanks, as always, to our indefatigable wine sponsors, Leopard's Leap. And, sorry, that was the second last word of thanks. No, it was the third last word of thanks. I'll be here for another hour. Second last word of thanks is, of course, the man on my right, Keith Gray, who I think got the conversation going in a very interesting way, and that is a testament to the content of what he shared with us today. So thank you very much to Keith. And lastly, I just want to say thank you to Gail, wherever she is, there she is, for putting this whole Writers' Conference together on behalf of the British Council. So thanks very much, and we'll hopefully see you in about an hour's time. Cheers.